Hello everyone. In this video we look at logging exception details when we build a workflow in UiPath. We know that UiPath provide an activity called log message, so we can use that to build our own workflow to log exception details. So whenever we use a try catch block, in a catch block we can use log message activity to log the exception details, but as our application gets bigger and we need to log a lot more details than just the exception message, it makes sense to create its own workflow and then use that workflow to call in each individual activity or in each individual try catch block. So in this case I've created a small workflow called log exception, and in that workflow we pass in arguments like where the exception occurred. So the first parameter is the exception object itself, then we pass in the parameter called file name, so this parameter will keep track of where the exception occurred. Unfortunately there is no way to actually get the file name dynamically, so we have to pass that parameter in as a static string. We can pass in exception message as well, so it, the exception message we can get from the exception object, but there is also, if you need to pass in additional um, text along with your exception message, then you can use this exception message string. So you can have your concatenate your custom string with the actual exception message, and if you want you can log the stack trace as well. So let's go through this one. So in the first thing we look at whether we pass in the file name, and if so we just say okay where the exception occurred in that file. Next thing we want to log is the exception message, so if we pass in exception message then we just log that exception message, otherwise we get the message detail from the exception object. Then we look at what activity within the workflow created an exception, because you might have a workflow where there might be like 10-15 activities being called within the same workflow. So we want to know which activity within that particular workflow caused an exception. So within the exception object there is a target site method base, so that gives us an ability to look at the method that actually caused the exception, and the reflected method can give you a more detail about that exception. So we log those two information, and if we want we can also log the stack trace. And as an additional build we also can look at the inner exception. This is particularly useful when the exception is caused further up the chain and we want to look at the inner exception. It can give us a more detail. So this part logs the inner exception message, and now what we can do is, instead of just calling log message, what we can do is call this log exception workflow whenever we want to log the exception details. So for testing purpose I've created this workflow where we try to open an Excel application which doesn't exist, so it will throw an exception, and in catch block we just call this log exception workflow, and in here we pass in parameters. So we pass in this exception object and we say which file it occurred in this case we're just saying it's a main.xaml file. If you have a file inside a folder then you can pass in the entire part of the file. We don't want to pass any custom message, so we leave this empty, but if you want you can pass in, say okay this is a custom error or something like that, and then you can concatenate with exception.message, so that way you can pass in some additional string parameter to it. But in this case we just want to leave it as is and we want to log the stack trace. So now when we debug the file, as you can see in the local pane, we can let the process run, and we'll be able to see what happens. So in the local, when we have this exception activity info object, and it does tell you precisely where the exception occurred, but when in a runtime environment this particular object is not available, so if you just run the file, then that information is not available. So in those cases it is useful to uh, this log exception message file will become useful to log all the details. So you can log in the exception message, exception is caused by this method and the reflected method, so you can make it out that this particular Excel activity had an issue, and then you can go and investigate what the actual cause is, and you can log the inner message and stack trace as well. So that is the purpose of this log exception workflow. Now, when doing the actual implementation work, this becomes quite useful and a reusable component, because now you can just change at one place this log exception, and you can change the way your exceptions are being logged. And also in your orchestrator you can let me log into the orchestrator, and when your processes are running you can actually go to your, so I'll log into my orchestrator and see that, okay, if there are processes which are running, then we can go to the logs and have a look at the logs to see, okay, these are the exceptions where this is occurring, and we can go and look at, okay, this is the file where exception is occurring, so you can go and then investigate that particular file. So that way it makes life a bit easier for us to keep track of where the exceptions are occurring. And I'll post the link to the GitHub repository along with this video, so you can download the source code and have a look at it. So that's it for this particular part.